qu'on fait converger les deux, on trouve de manière objective, explicite, les intérêts communs et les priorités communes pour changer un peu la manière dont on travaille, qu'on n'ait plus une stratégie de l'Union européenne pour l'Union africaine, mais une stratégie de l'Union européenne avec l'Union africaine. Ça, c'est le premier point. Le deuxième point, c'est qu'on introduise au maximum, dans tous les instruments nouveaux dont nous allons convenir avec nos partenaires africains, une notion très simple et essentielle dans les relations internationales, qui est celle de la réciprocité. Donc il est important qu'on quitte la démarche qu'on a pu avoir jusqu'à présent, où on avait un bloc au nord qui était essentiellement constitué d'un groupe de bailleurs qui regardaient le continent africain comme un terrain vers lequel il fallait délivrer de l'aide au développement, et à l'inverse des partenaires qui considéraient l'Union européenne presque comme un bailleur exclusivement et pas comme un ensemble de partenaires politiques et comme un partenaire politique. Donc nous avons, et je m'arrêterai là, nous avons vraiment la capacité dans les semaines et les mois qui viennent de redéfinir sur la base d'intérêts objectifs communs la manière dont nous entendons promouvoir ensemble ces intérêts communs.
Merci, Monsieur l'ambassadeur, pour ces clarifications. Nous avons Monsieur Ndiaye, bienvenue.
Merci.
Je vois que les problèmes techniques ont été réglés, donc c'est vraiment un plaisir de vous avoir parmi nous. Je disais tout à l'heure que ça serait particulièrement intéressant de pouvoir bénéficier de votre analyse sur l'expérience de l'Afrique centrafricaine en particulier. Madame Tété avait soulevé la question des pays émergents de conflits en particulier et les défis auxquels ils faisaient face. Je disais aussi que en faisant référence au plan national de relèvement et de consolidation de la paix de la République centrafricaine, qui met en évidence le lien entre l'insécurité, la perturbation des échanges commerciaux et les moyens de subsistance de la population. Ce même plan national soulève aussi plusieurs questions, dont celle des groupes marginalisés, auxquels aussi l'ambassadeur Mahecho a fait référence. Le besoin de reconstruire l'infrastructure. Donc, il y a beaucoup de questions qui sont déjà soulevées dans ce rapport. Et donc, ma question pour vous était comment voyez-vous la contribution de la ZLECAf à ces efforts? Vous avez la parole, Monsieur Ndiaye.
Merci beaucoup, madame. J'espère que vous m'entendez bien. Merci beaucoup. D'abord, merci pour le forum de Tana, de m'avoir invité à participer pour la première fois. Je voudrais saluer aussi la présence d'amis, mon ami Anna et mon ami également Rémi. J'ai bien suivi leur contribution, même si j'avais des problèmes techniques, mais j'écoutais très bien les analyses qu'ils viennent de faire et que je partage entièrement. Alors, nous sommes... Vous m'entendez pas?
Très bien, Monsieur Ndiaye.
Oui. Alors, donc, je disais que je souhaiterais très rapidement aborder mon intervention sous l'angle du dynamisme de l'intégration régionale, mais dans un contexte également de crise. Et la question que je me suis posée est très simple. Comment mettre en œuvre la ZLECAf dans un contexte de pays en crise? Comme vous le savez aussi, beaucoup de pays africains sont en crise et sur le continent aussi, vous avez beaucoup d'opérations de maintien de la paix, parmi les plus importantes des Nations Unies à travers le monde. Je reviendrai très rapidement en mettant l'accent sur le cas de la République centrafricaine. il y a, de mon point de vue, une relation vertueuse entre interdépendance économique et paix entre États. Nous pouvons citer beaucoup d'exemples. L'exemple de l'Union européenne est là, l'Union en a parlé. Il y a l'exemple également de la CEDEAO, qui est l'une des organisations régionales qui marche le mieux, je pense. Et les principes d'interdépendance et de responsabilité partagée dans des domaines économiques impliquent aussi une certaine maîtrise des flux des biens, des flux des personnes et des services qui sous-tendent des structures étatiques fonctionnelles avec toutes les compétences régaliennes d'un État. Et quels sont les enjeux de l'intégration économique et politique dans une Afrique plurielle? La ZLECA est entrée en vigueur, comme vous le savez, avec 22 États signataires et c'est l'un des projets phares de l'agenda 2063 de l'Union africaine. Le potentiel et les enjeux sont colossaux. C'est un grand défi pour l'Afrique. Un potentiel de 54 États, l'association éventuelle à terme de 13 territoires ouvrant des perspectives sur d'autres unions économiques également, un PIB de plus de 3,4 trillions de dollars, un marché africain en forte croissance, estimé à plus d'1 milliard de consommateurs. Et donc, les enjeux de sa mise en œuvre sont tout aussi importants. Et l'objectif, c'est de créer les conditions où la libre circulation des biens, des personnes et des services se fera sans entrave. Malheureusement, cette ambition tout à fait louable est mise à mal dans le contexte africain par les différentes crises sur le continent qui sont remarquables par leur complexité, par leur nombre, mais aussi par leur durée. Il y a des crises qui durent depuis plus de 10 ans, voire plus. À ce jour, 50% des opérations de paix des Nations Unies sont déployées sur le continent. Et parmi les opérations les plus importantes, je pense à la MINUSMA au Mali, je pense à la MONUSCO, pas loin de chez moi, en RDC, et à la MINUSCA, parmi les opérations les plus importantes des Nations Unies. Néanmoins, une voie vers l'intégration économique et politique offre une opportunité pour forcer le chemin, la transformation pacifique des États en crise. Le cas centrafricain est remarquable. Rémi connaît bien la Centrafrique pour y avoir été comme diplomate il y a quelques années auparavant. Et l'intégration économique et politique est à la fois un prérequis et je pense une solution pour l'État centrafricain confronté à une série de crises depuis 1997. Et la Centrafrique n'est pas signataire de la ZLECA, à cause certainement de son incapacité actuelle à se conformer au cahier de charges structurel et à appliquer des réformes qui permettent la mise en œuvre de la ZLECA. Je n'insisterai pas sur le mandat de la MINUSCA et ce que nous faisons en Centrafrique pour appuyer l'État à se relever. Mais je dirais que nous sommes dans un pays où les ressources naturelles sont considérables, sont diversifiées. Vous avez l'or, le diamant, vous avez du bois précieux, vous avez de l'uranium, des terres arables, une transhumance qui se développe, certainement du pétrole, mais la Centrafrique, c'est le 170e PIB mondial, c'est 194 selon le FMI, et les populations vivent essentiellement d'une économie souterraine et non contrôlée. Les dividendes échappent complètement, presque, aux caisses de l'État et rejoignent des circuits parallèles qui soutiennent les groupes armés qui interviennent dans ce pays, soit des groupes armés qui interviennent en Centrafrique, qui sont dans des pays limitrophes. Ces groupes armés, acteurs non étatiques, contestent le rôle de l'État sur une grande partie du territoire, font compétition à l'État et lui refusent donc tout accès à une capacité réelle sur son territoire et sa population. Et exploitent illégalement ces ressources naturelles, les commercialisent illégalement et financent leur armement, donc une véritable économie de de guerre. Nous sommes aussi dans un environnement qui n'est pas du tout facile, et c'est pourquoi nous insistons particulièrement, les Nations Unies insistent particulièrement sur la dynamique régionale, donc sur l'intégration régionale. Parce que la ZLECAf va se fonder naturellement sur les communautés économiques régionales, sans lesquelles elle ne peut pas fonctionner. Et donc, si les communautés économiques régionales ne fonctionnent pas, ne marchent pas, je vois mal comment la ZLECAf va marcher. Donc, c'est extrêmement important de fortifier, je pense, les communautés économiques régionales. Nous en avons ici en Afrique centrale, la communauté économique des États de l'Afrique centrale. Il y a également la CEMA, ça c'est au plan monétaire, qui pendant longtemps n'a pas véritablement fonctionné comme il se devait. C'est ainsi que les chefs d'État ont décidé de la réforme, d'une réforme structurelle fondamentale de la CAC en instituant une commission de la CAC à la place d'un secrétaire général. La commission vient d'être créée, un nouveau président de la commission vient d'être nommé avec des commissaires. Donc, nous fondons beaucoup d'espoir à la redynamisation de la CAC pour, en tout cas, promouvoir l'intégration régionale, la dynamique régionale. Donc, c'est extrêmement important d'insister sur le fonctionnement des communautés économiques régionales. Donc, nous sommes dans une sous-région en manque d'intégration, véritablement, manque d'intégration. Donc, il faut donner un nouveau souffle au processus d'intégration. Et il est un fait que la stabilité du pays passe par un engagement beaucoup plus important des pays limitrophes de la région, de manière collégiale, de manière inclusive, afin de répondre aux multiples défis. L'accord politique pour la paix et la réconciliation en RCA, qui a été signé le 6 février 2019, prévoit à juste titre un rôle important aux pays de la région qui sont tous des facilitateurs. Le Tchad, je pense au Tchad, je pense au Soudan, à la RDC, au Congo, au Cameroun, et qui jouent un rôle extrêmement important, et aux garants, parce que nous avons deux garants également, la communauté économique des États de l'Afrique centrale et l'Union africaine qui jouent le rôle de garant de l'accord. Alors, pour terminer, c'est ma conviction profonde que l'étape de l'intégration économique régionale continentale aura un impact positif réel sur la transformation des conflits, notamment en ce qui concerne la Centrafrique, car elle nécessitera une montée en puissance préalable des institutions et des moyens régaliens de la Centrafrique pour, en tout cas, stabiliser le pays. J'insisterai sur la nécessité d'une bonne gestion des ressources naturelles importantes du continent. C'est important aussi la question des ressources naturelles. On met beaucoup l'accent sur la richesse du continent à tout point de vue. Mais la question de la gestion des ressources naturelles également est une question aussi qu'il ne faut pas exclure. Comment ces ressources sont gérées par les pays qui les possèdent, comment les populations également en bénéficient. Donc, je voudrais encore une fois, chers collègues, vous remercier de votre invitation. Je vais m'en arrêter là en disant encore une fois que la ZLECAf est un projet ambitieux, mais une ambition tout à fait légitime. Il peut se réaliser, mais il y a des préconditions à remplir. Il faut effectivement que nous travaillions tous pour la paix du continent, pour que les crises qui se vivent sur le continent, qui sont nombreuses, complexes, également qui freinent le processus de développement des États et qui freinent également l'intégration, que ces crises puissent trouver le plus rapidement une solution. Je vous remercie.
Merci, Monsieur Ndiaye. If you'd allow me just a follow-up question. You raised the question of different armed groups who are contesting the space, often illegal exploitation of natural resources, tension between communal groups, etc. Again, looking at the CFTA in particular, is there, very concretely speaking, a role it can play in mitigating these risks, or do we say it's actually, we're putting the la charrue devant le bœuf? So are we moving a bit too quickly, and we need to stabilize along the lines of the peace agreement first, before we start speaking of delivering and supporting different communal groups?
Bon, je crois qu'ici, le nexus paix, sécurité et développement est évident. On ne peut pas dire qu'on va d'abord résoudre les crises sur le continent avant d'aller à l'intégration. Je crois qu'il faut marcher sur les deux jambes. Autant les pays africains font face à des crises multiples, parfois intérieures, mais autant aussi il faut travailler au développement de l'intégration économique. Je prends l'exemple de la CEDEAO. Vous avez dans l'espace CEDEAO, Afrique de l'Ouest, vous avez eu des crises dans le passé. Vous avez eu la crise, les conflits au Libéria, les conflits en Sierra Leone. Bon, aujourd'hui, la crise au Mali, à un moment donné également une crise en Côte d'Ivoire pendant presque 10 ans. Mais malgré tout, l'institution a continué à fonctionner. Malgré tout, les objectifs d'intégration économique fixés par la CEDEAO ont continué à être mis en œuvre. Mais en même temps aussi, l'impact est négatif également sur le processus d'intégration. L'impact est négatif. Et donc, je dis donc, il faut qu'on mette davantage l'accent sur le règlement des crises en Afrique. Je disais tout à l'heure, regardez le nombre d'opérations de maintien de la paix sur le continent. Même en Afrique centrale où je suis, vous avez 2 opérations de maintien de la paix majeures. La MONUSCO, dans un des pays les plus vastes, les plus riches également de la région, les plus importants de la région, et la MINUSCA en Afrique centrale, un pays extrêmement vaste aussi, très vaste, qui fait la France et la Belgique réunies en termes de superficie. La Belgique et la France réunies en termes de superficie, de 622 000 km², avec seulement une population d'à peine 5 millions d'habitants. À peine 5 millions d'habitants. Vous voyez, donc, vous avez un État qui peine à contrôler son territoire, un État qui ne contrôle aucune de ses frontières. Vous voyez, le handicap pour aller vers l'intégration est évident. Quand un pays ne contrôle aucune de ses frontières, ne contrôle pas les flux des ressources, les échanges commerciaux, ça pose un très grand problème pour avancer vers l'intégration économique. Donc, il y a cette dialectique-là entre paix, développement et intégration qu'il faut bien comprendre. Donc, je disais que les crises constituent un frein aussi à la mise en œuvre intégrale de la ZLECAf. Ça aussi, il ne faut pas le perdre de vue. L'ambition est là, il faut travailler à la mettre en œuvre, à la réaliser, mais il ne faut pas aussi fermer les yeux sur les entraves fondamentales, n'est-ce pas, au développement de l'intégration. L'autre aspect pour le continent, je pense qu'il faut un projet politique aussi. Si on n'a pas un projet politique très clair, il est difficile d'avancer résolument sur l'intégration économique. Parce que l'intégration économique, ce n'est pas un objectif en soi. Il faut un projet politique. Quel est le projet politique de la CEDEAO? Quel est le projet politique de la CAC? Il faut se poser la question. Ouais, l'Union européenne a un projet politique extrêmement important. Et justement, tant qu'on n'a pas de projet politique, il est difficile d'aller résolument vers l'intégration. Donc, il faut en même temps qu'on développe l'intégration régionale, il faut également un projet politique. Il faut qu'il y ait une vision politique également des communautés économiques régionales de l'Union africaine de manière générale. Est-ce que l'objectif, c'est l'intégration en soi? Est-ce que ce n'est pas un projet politique continental, une fédération des États, etc. Donc, c'est des questions également que je me pose, parce que depuis plus de 50 ans qu'on parle d'intégration économique, il faut en faire le bilan aussi. L'intégration économique, depuis que la CEDEAO a été créée en 1975, où est-ce que nous en sommes au plan de l'intégration économique? Où en est le commerce intra-africain? Bon, la ZLECA vise à développer naturellement le commerce intra-africain, la libre circulation des marchandises. Mais la dimension politique également de l'intégration économique ne doit pas être perdue de vue.
Merci beaucoup, M. Ndiaye, pour ces clarifications. Des points très importants, en effet, hein, le projet politique qui accompagne cette vision économique. On revient encore au débat autour de l'accord d'Abuja, etc., ce qui est la nécessité, en fait, de revoir ces textes et de les analyser et de les critiquer des années, même des décennies plus tard est très, très important. Je vous remercie. On m'indique que Madame Cristina Duarte is online. So we can proceed, I think, to invite her. Madam Cristina Duarte is the UN Under Secretary General and the United Nations Special Advisor on Africa. She's fresh almost, I would say, in her post, which she assumed on the 1st of August 2020. So, Madam Duarte, let me welcome you by saying obrigada por estar conosco. Thank you for being with us today. Just briefly for our audience and listeners, for them to be aware a bit of your background. As a Special Advisor for Africa, you're the Strategic Advisor of the UN Secretary General on the interlinkages between peace and development in Africa. You've served as Minister of Finance, Planning and Public Administration in Cabo Verde for 10 years. You were also director of a World Bank reform program on private sector development and competitiveness. You've served also in the private sector as a vice president of Citibank in Angola. And not least on the continental level, you were a member of President Kagame's advisory committee on the African Union reforms. My question to you today, Madam Duarte, is that we're going obviously through a very particular time for the world and also for Africa due to COVID-19. You recently stated that the lockdowns have pushed Africa, and I quote, pushed Africa into the first socioeconomic crisis in 25 years. One might argue that the impact of such economic or socioeconomic crisis on the stability of the continent, if left unaddressed, can be costly. So moving forward, how do you see the role of the CFTA in mitigating the risks of instability in a post-COVID Africa? Over to you, Madam Duarte.
Thank you for the opportunity. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know that you are in different times. Addressing your question, I would like to take the opportunity to raise a couple of issues. First, Africans or African policymakers should see themselves in a situation that failure is not an option. What I mean that the implementation of the continental free trade cannot be failed, because failure in this case is not an option. Because if we look in the past 50 years, the continental free trade area might be the only opportunity for Africa to move away from a reliance on external donors, foreign creditors, excessive commodity dependence. Again, the free trade area might be the opportunity, and I would like to stress the opportunity to boost African economies by promoting trade liberalization at the continental level. So everybody knows the numbers around the continental free trade area. Everybody. 1.3 billion people, a GDP of 2.2 trillion, and the transition phase might generate, gains around $50 billion and boost intra-trade by 33%. Only these numbers make the implementation of the continental free trade area cannot fail. So failure is not an option. We all know, because we have been talking about this continental free trade area, was not since 2015. Let's go back. Since the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 20s, we have been talking about economic integration at the continental level. What do we know? We know that of course, the free trade area will require strong policy making, for example, in the nexus trade industrialization, infrastructure, and private sector promotion policies. But we also all know that the main challenge is a small one, but a big one at the same time. Made in Africa. How we are going to build the Made in Africa. How we are going to move from made in Cote d'Ivoire, made in Botswana, made in Rwanda, made in Algeria, to made in Africa, which means the challenge is how we are going to agree the 54 countries on the rules of origin. Third, we all know that the regional economic committees and associated regional trade agreements are not obstacles. On the contrary, they are the building blocks. Thanks to these regional economic communities, that much stone has been broken in the past 20 years. So what I'd like to propose in this conversation, that maybe we reach a stage that we need to undertake a quite serious and courageous analysis, SWOT analysis, where we know very well our strengths, our weaknesses, our opportunities, and our threats. Because to reach in such short period of time the agreement, because the agreement has been ratified and in May 2019 it went live, of course, there was at that time, it was clear for everybody that the continental free trade had huge opportunities for the continent. So I believe that as of today, everybody is aware of the opportunities of this agreement. I would like, if you allow me, to bring the strengths, but more important, the threats and the weaknesses. Because I do believe that in the next 5 to 10 years, these are the issues that should be addressed so that the opportunities are indeed grabbed by policymakers. So in doing this SWOT analysis, I hope it will help us understand the threats and the weaknesses of the interlinkage between the continental free trade area and conflict transformation, and how it could better inform African policymakers in leveraging the strengths to better grasp the opportunities. So I believe that we'll be able to tackle the lack of peace and security as a threat to the implementation of the agreement. But at the same time, the implementation of the agreement as an opportunity to address peace and security. Who comes first? Who comes first? The lack of peace and security as a threat to the implementation of the agreement, or the implementation of the agreement as an opportunity to address peace and security? I would say that what comes first is a discussion that, in my opinion, does not make sense. So going to the strengths. The first one that I would like to bring to this roundtable is the strong political will, and has been mentioned before. Let's keep the momentum. The strong political will manifested by African policymakers, translated by the record time in signing and ratifying the agreement, and adoption of major frameworks such as the Single African Air Transportation Market, the Protocol on the Free Movement of Persons, as well as silenced guns. So I do believe that strong political will is our first strength. We cannot forget, talking about the strong political will, we cannot forget that the continental free trade area is an African issue with a global geopolitical dimension. Africa is the last frontier of the system. It is a strong stage of geopolitical interests. If you want to implement the Continental Free Trade Area, we need to keep the momentum in terms of strong political will so that we can manage the geopolitical dimension of its implementation. The second strength are the existence of the regional economic communities, the African Union. As of today, despite the problems, we do have continental and regional institutions that are ready to deliver the implementation despite the problems. Now to the weaknesses. For me, there are essentially two weaknesses. The first one is at institutional capacity, the lack of an institutional capacity framework that can enforce the implementation of the agreement at national levels. And these include, of course, low levels of security and intelligence cooperation among countries to overcome common threats. For example, as of today, African countries do not have customs to implement, for example, the rules of origin, to implement the Made in Africa. The second weakness that I would like to stress are the profile of the African states, as has been mentioned by my predecessor. As of today, African states do not control the territory. African states, as they have been enumerating after the independence, they were only performing two functions: collect taxes and keep the political and social order. If we compare the African state profile in the 60s, as of today, from a science political standpoint, we'll see that very little has changed. Too many organizations, lots of organizations, lots of departments, lots of agencies, lots of institutes. But let's squeeze the orange. And we end up with, again, these two main functions: collect taxes, and in a very inefficient way, and keep the political and social order, which has been eroded in the past 10, 15 years by the terrorism action in Africa. So in my view, these are the two main weaknesses: weak institutions at the national level and the profile of African states. Threats, I would like also to mention two threats. The first one that I would like to mention are the external factors. And these are related to the fact that Africa is indeed a stage for geopolitical interests that might interfere with the level of union, engagement, commitment, need to deliver the agreement. The agreement is supposed to create a 1.3 billion market. The question is, who is going to feed that market in goods and services? The idea is to give the possibility to the African private sector, to African companies, including African SMEs and smallholder farmers. Therefore, the Continental Free Trade Area is the opportunity to create African multinationals based on strong regional and continental value chains, allowing to improve Africa's position in the global value chains. Second threat, trade disputes that might arise among African countries could threaten the success of the agreement. Of course, in these disputes, they need to have strong institutions and mechanisms, strong institutions and settlement mechanisms to deal with them. Opportunities. I will not mention all of them, because the opportunities dimension of a SWOT analysis is exactly what everybody knows. Because what exactly a clear consciences of these opportunities that have led to the creation of the continental free trade area. Again, the 1.3 billion markets, 1.2 billion consumers with an aggregate income of 2.5 trillion, etc., etc. So the opportunities are very well known for everybody. So I do believe that we reach a stage from an African policy making standpoint that we need indeed to address the weaknesses, the threats, leveraging our strengths, so that we are in a position to grab the opportunities that might be brought by the continental free trade area. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Duarte, for this thought-provoking intervention. You've highlighted quite a number of issues, and I think this point that we need to be very conscious of the fact that there's a very strong geopolitical dimension to us introducing the CFTA, and how that features in our different engagements is very critical. I'm aware that Madam Tete has to leave us within the next 5 minutes. So if you allow me, there was just one question that was addressed to her that I'd like her to answer before she leaves, and then we can continue with the Q&A session. I would encourage our listeners to post their questions in the messages box. And for those who are present in the room, kindly indicate that to the organizers, and they can always pass on the question so that we introduce it. Madam Tete, there was one particular question for you. The person is asking, how do you see the link between the CFTA and conflict transformation through stronger synergies between the different AU flagship projects, namely silencing the guns, consolidating governance through the African governance architecture, and the CFTA?
Thank you very much. The CFTA is essentially, let us remember once again, it's about trade. And trade takes place sometimes with companies producing that are state-owned enterprises, but more often than not, we want to encourage the private sector. So I think when you get down to the brass tacks of it, you have to ask yourself, how are we going to integrate policy development at the national level that is aligned to policy at the regional level to ensure that the intended beneficiaries of these policies, namely our African enterprises, are able to take advantage of these new developments, promote their businesses, promote their exports, export more within our countries in order to be able to generate revenue for themselves, and consequently, they will become wealthier, there'll be more tax revenue for the state, and then we will see that the economies will be able to promote development. So I think that while it's very good to discuss this issue from a level of 10,000 feet and look in terms of the broader policy dimensions, let's always remember that policy is meant to benefit and to advantage particular groups in order that they can thrive. And in the case of the AfCFTA, that's what we're talking about. When we talk about rules of origin in the AfCFTA, what we're saying is that we want to have an agreement on the amount of local content that has to be in a product or in a service in order to qualify for the duty exemptions, and therefore to be able to be more competitive vis-a-vis products from any other part of the world that are being charged duty in order to be able to enter into that market, and of course will be available for consumption. So the point I want to make is this. While the generality of flagship initiatives that were developed under Agenda 2063 are all different parts of a puzzle in order to promote Africa's growth and development. The devil, in terms of the successful implementation of any of these, lies in the detail. I think that we need to focus on the detail of how we get to this implementation, achieving the objective of using as much local content as possible and encouraging the production of that local content, allowing, whether it is commodities, intermediate processed goods or finished goods, to be exported to other African countries duty-free in an effort to make them more competitive as against exports from any other part of the world, and how that should help the economies to be able to expand their market access beyond their national boundaries within the sub-region and within the region. Now, I know this sounds like a bit of a technical explanation, but again, I think it's important for us to focus on the actual and not on the theory. If we are able to ensure that these various policies, for instance, it's going to be difficult to have trade and under the AfCFTA if we don't also look at freedom of movement. Because if you have to go through every embassy every time you are going to have to get a visa to go to another African country, chances are that is going to make it very difficult for you to trade there. And there's always the option that your visa might be rejected anyway, so that you might not even be able to go. So you've got to look at the various building blocks that are required to facilitate trade. And I think that's where we build the synergies. We look at what are the policies that need to be implemented immediately to promote greater trade among African countries and greater local production, taking advantage of the rules of origin, so that at the end of the day, the benefits are found in our countries. Now, let me just make that a bit more practical, because again, let's take a country like Ethiopia, where we are at the moment. Ethiopia produces wonderful coffee. And the trade infrastructure that was set up through the Ethiopian Commodity Exchange allows for thousands of small-scale farmers to be able to sell their produce and they have been assisted to be able to produce at a specific quality and to generate revenue for themselves based on the quality of their produce. That gives them an incentive to do better. Because of the policies that were formulated in the development of the ECX, the Ethiopian government now has the benefit of aggregation of large volumes of coffee, which allow them to export a consistent quality, not just to African countries, but to the rest of the world. And they can attract premium prices for their products. All of the interventions that went into creating that support mechanism for that structure to be established to allow for the successful export of the coffee has created a situation where farmers in those communities have better incomes, more stable incomes, and therefore, once they are able to look after themselves, there's less competition for other things because they have the resources to be able to buy. So please, as we talk about this within the context of conflict, peace, and security, and understanding that all of these issues are interlinked, let us understand that different policy regimes and different programs have to be implemented in specific ways in order to achieve the identified outcomes. And we cannot always necessarily put them all together and talk about them and say, this is just going to be wonderful, without looking at the detail of how we make it happen. If we focus on how we make it happen, and we make sure that we do the implementation well, this can be a game changer. But we have to look at the specifics. We have to be realistic. We have to think about how we are going to fund those investments. And we are going to have to think about how those countries, especially the most fragile, are going to deal with the revenue loss from the loss of customs revenue at the time when this is implemented, what the impact will be in their economies, and therefore how we give them the incentives to continue to implement, to achieve the desired outcomes in the medium term. Once again, I'd like to thank the Tana Forum organizers for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I have to leave early because I have another meeting that I'm now going to enter into online. But it has been a pleasure to be here with all the other panelists. And I hope that as a result, we can be more pragmatic in our thinking about how we make the AfCFTA a game changer for the fragile countries emerging from conflict, so that we can promote their growth and development and help them to be better off than they are currently. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if you can hear me. But thank you very much to Madame Tete for joining us and for that particular intervention also. Thank you. Just let me open the floor to introduce some of the questions that we've had. One of the questions is specifically asked to the ambassador of France, and the participant is asking, with the CFTA ready to kick off, would the European Union continue to pursue the economic partnership agreements, the so-called EPAs, with African countries? So that's particularly a question for the French ambassador. There was also a question, and I would put it on the floor and invite the different panelists to reflect on that. Is the question on the extent to which the CFTA helps the realization and improvement of equal gender participation in the economic sector, and what measures have been planned so far. I think linked to that particular issue is the question of how do we ensure that the CFTA benefits the different actors in African economies. Madame Duarte raised the issue of, for instance, or at least the ambition that we would like to make sure that the CFTA provides opportunity for African private sector, SMEs. I'm thinking to the cross-border traders, which happen to be predominantly females. So how do we ensure that the CFTA equally benefits the different economic groups within the continent, first and foremost? I open the floor. I think perhaps because there was a specific question to you, Mr. Ambassador Marichou, you can maybe proceed.
I'm sorry, the quality of the sound was not good enough. Could you
no
rephrase
problem.
the question, please?
The question was, considering the entry into force of the CFTA, or the imminent entry into force of the CFTA, what would the European Union do with the economic partnership agreements, the EPAs? Is there intention to still pursue those? I hope the question is now audible.
Non, c'est bon, c'est clair. Merci. Merci. Non, c'est vrai qu'il y a la logique de la zone de libre-échange continentale va nécessairement conduire à revoir le cadre des accords de partenariat économique. D'autant plus que la plupart des accords de partenariat économique existants actuellement sont des accords intérimaires. Donc, il est évident que à mesure que l'Africa CFTA devient une réalité, le cadre de nos échanges commerciaux particulièrement, devra être revu pour s'adapter à cette nouvelle réalité.
Merci, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur. Can I invite the other panelists perhaps to also respond to the other question in terms of benefits that we can expect with respect to gender participation, but also the equal distribution, I would dare say, of the benefits of the CFTA across the different economic groups on the continent. So not just big organizations, but if we can ensure that there's some form of trickle down, and how do we approach that?
Je vais essayer de répondre. je ne sais pas si vous m'entendez. Oui, ça renvoie à des questions que j'ai évoquées tout à l'heure et que Madame Tété elle-même a évoquées. C'est que il va y avoir dans un premier temps des déséquilibres, il va y avoir des pays qui vont être plus directement bénéficiaires de l'intégration économique à court terme que d'autres. Je pense particulièrement à la situation des pays enclavés. Quand on regarde les statistiques, ceux des pays d'Afrique pour lesquels les droits de douane sur le commerce intra-africain a le plus d'importance dans les budgets, ce sont les pays enclavés. Donc, il y aura cette première question à prendre en charge en termes de compensation. Ensuite, il y a le risque, si on arrive très vite à une liberté commerciale à l'intérieur de cette grande zone, que certains facteurs de production quittent les pays enclavés pour se rapprocher des côtes pour produire moins cher. Donc tout ça devra faire l'objet de mécanismes de compensation, et ça nécessite un pilotage global pour mesurer qui à court terme est pénalisé pour essayer de compenser. Ça c'est le premier point. Le deuxième point, on revient sur la question de la volonté politique, c'est que certains pays ne vont pas bénéficier directement à court terme de la création de la zone, et c'est un peu le problème qu'on a au sein de l'Union européenne. Dans l'Union européenne, nous avons des pays qui sont ce qu'on appelle des contributeurs nets, c'est-à-dire qui payent plus à l'organisation que ce qu'ils reçoivent de l'organisation. Maintenant, ils acceptent de le faire parce qu'il y a des bénéfices induits, il y a des bénéfices à long terme, il y a des bénéfices politiques. Donc ça, c'est le deuxième point que je voulais faire, et ça renvoie à ce que je disais dans ma présentation, c'est que la condition essentielle pour que cet accord puisse être mis en œuvre, c'est la permanence d'une volonté politique. Mais la chance de l'Union africaine, c'est que cette organisation est d'abord politique, en train de se transformer en organisation économique. C'est un peu le chemin inverse de ce qu'a fait l'Union européenne. Et donc, on peut penser que la volonté politique sera suffisante pour dépasser toutes ces difficultés et régler tous les problèmes que soulignait Madame Tété, qui vont se révéler progressivement. Le diable est dans les détails, comme elle l'a dit.
Madame Duarte, would you also like to intervene on this point?
Sorry, would you like to repeat the question? Sound is really bad. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, the question was, how do we ensure, one of the questions that came from the participants is, how do we ensure that the CFTA can benefit the participation of women in the economy? And I was making the link to a point that you raised earlier, which is that we wanted CFTA to benefit different groups in Africa, different economic groups from private sector, but not just the large, but also SMEs, etc. So the question was, what kind of mechanisms can be introduced in order to make sure that there is a certain trickle-down effect of the benefits of the CFTA?
Thank you very much. Allow me to respond this question, maybe not in a traditional way, with your permission. I think that we have the tendency, when discussing a policy-making issue, such as this one, Continental Free Trade Area, I believe that we have the tendency to try to think that this issue, in this case, the Continental Free Trade Area, will solve all the problems. You always have this tendency to approach these policy-making issues as a sort of panacea. I believe that the Continental Free Trade Area will create a single market, economies of scale, that will promote Africa's industrialization to feed the growing middle class in Africa. These economic phenomena, they need to be clearly followed by strong states, by strong regulatory frameworks, to make sure that indeed the benefits of this single market, of this economies of scale, of this industrialization, do reach every socioeconomic group in Africa. Women, youth, elderly, etc., etc. So I would like to say that yes, indeed, we reach a point that we do need this single market in Africa to deliver the 2063 agenda, but the only way to do without creating imbalances, without creating socioeconomic imbalances, without marginalizing human, without marginalizing youth, etc., is by at the same time create stronger states with a clear political will to set up strong regulatory frameworks, rules that make the game a previsible game. So I do believe this is the way to do. So income distribution policies should be in the list since the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Duarte. We'll allow one question from a participant before we, or let him ask the question himself, before we conclude this session. I realize there's still much more to say. But Professor Zaghloumi, if you can please step in, keep your question short. And to the point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Faten Agad. Good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Of course, I'm just wondering how we can implement CFTA while guns are not silenced, while still foreign military presence is growing in Africa. And of course, this question of peace and security. If we are not securing the whole aspect of stability in Africa, how we can implement this. More than that, there is another element. When we talked about African Union and its willing to erect cooperation and I would say economic integration, and African should have the right to deal with Union Europe, of course, but also with China, with Russia, with Japan, with India, and she should have this right to do business as usual. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Zaghloumi. Monsieur Ndiaye, vous voulez peut-être répondre très brièvement à cette question. Je suis pas sûre qu'il y avait vraiment une question, mais c'est le point qui soulevait et que, bon, est-ce qu'on peut vraiment parler d'intégration économique tant que les guns were not silenced. Donc, si vous voulez répondre à la question ou quelques réflexions de votre part. Votre micro, Monsieur Ndiaye. Vous êtes sur mute.
Oui. Oui, je disais que la question qui est posée par le professeur est une question très, très importante. Je l'ai en partie abordée dans mon intervention. Je crois que la question de la paix et de la sécurité, c'est une question fondamentale. Je pense qu'il faut tout faire parce que la ZLECA va entrer en vigueur en 2021, au moment où la campagne de l'Union africaine faire taire les armes, créer des conditions favorables au développement de l'Afrique, au moment où cette campagne va s'achever. Donc, il faudrait quand même que nous puissions continuer à accorder tout l'intérêt au règlement des crises sur le continent, parce que c'est un facteur entravant au développement du commerce intra-africain. Ça, c'est extrêmement important, faire en sorte que la paix revienne sur le continent. Et la paix va contribuer à la promotion du commerce entre les États, du commerce intra-africain, du commerce régional. Et donc, il faut continuer en même temps qu'on mettra en œuvre la ZLECA, vraiment tout faire pour le règlement des crises sur le continent. Je pense que c'est important. Il ne faut pas perdre cela à ce but. Moi, je prends toujours l'exemple de pays comme la Centrafrique. comment la crise pénalise un peu le développement de l'intégration régionale. Nous prenons l'exemple également de la CEDEAO, également, comment la crise au Mali impacte même sur les activités de l'Union économique et monétaire ouest-africaine, dont le Mali est membre, sur l'activité de la CEDEAO qui se mobilise. Au lieu de promouvoir le développement économique, le commerce, la CEDEAO passe beaucoup plus de temps à gérer, à régler des crises qu'à mettre l'accent sur le développement du commerce régional. Donc, la dialectique est là très évidente. Donc, il faut continuer à mettre l'accent sur la paix et la sécurité sur le continent comme facteur également d'intégration économique sur le continent. Merci.
Monsieur Ndiaye. I think with this we would like to wrap up the session. Perhaps some highlights from my end. I think our different speakers reminded us that we need a healthy dose of realism without despairing at the same time. I think there is it's very clear from the different interventions that we have an opportunity before us, that failure is not an option. But we still need to work hard. I felt that some of the key points that were raised is to still bring us back to this question that we still need strong states to implement successfully and to ensure that the benefits to be reaped from the CFTA are felt by everyone. A reminder also that we still need very strong regional economic communities to close the gap, so to speak, between the continental and the national. A reminder that we need to treat its framework and focus on its implementation, the details of its implementation in its own right. That the CFTA remains primarily a trade instrument, but that we have other instruments that are potentially very important. A reminder, last but not least, that we there is a very strong geopolitical dimension that we need to be aware of. How do we structure our engagement with our different partners, be it the EU, be it China, be it the US? Is very important to our success, but also to whether or not there will be limitations to the implementation of the CFTA. With that, I would like to thank all our panelists for making the time. I know time is gold. So thank you everyone for making the time. Thanks to the audience for joining. And it's over to you, Brian. Thank you.
Why don't we give them a pom-pom, I think, for a thank you, Faten, Excellencies, thank you so much. There is something that has resonated throughout all the sessions. It's the reminder that any project of development that leaves people out or that does not take cognizance of the context and the peculiarities in the context is likely to fail. Not because it is not technically sound, but because of the African proverb that says, people don't care so much about what you know and can do until they know that you care about them. So as we take the break, I just wanted to remind those who are following us online and Excellencies in the room that the fundamental question as we look across the continent is this disconnect that African young people and women feel from the economy as it was before COVID and from the economy as it is in the context of COVID. And that disconnect creates discontent. And unless trust is built in the implementation, and that's what we've heard from this session, unless trust is built, as well as an infrastructure that enables the humanization of the regionalization of our trade agenda, then what you will have is a breakdown of something that's meant to be good. So I wish to remind you of something that was in the 2019 State of Peace and Security report as we part. And that was the idea that the interconnectedness of livelihoods, of social policy and economic policy, as well as environmental policy, has a way of manufacturing for us, not just conflict, but also a way of manufacturing for us opportunity. So as we prepare for the next session, just remember that we are here not to describe the impossibilities of a continental free trade agreement or the difficulties, nor are we here in a romantic mode to describe the potential. Excellency, I have in the African tradition been telling stories. So I wish to tell this story specifically for you because you will remember it as a story from Tana. Excellency, there is a young lady that said to us once we were gathered in a room that the word potential must never be allowed or used again in Africa. And the reason why that word should not be used is because of the experience of women. She then said her grandmother's story is the story of her mother and her own. That when a young woman is about the age of 16 or 17 or 18, she falls in love with a young man who she says he has potential to make a good life partner, right? And when he's in his 20s, he's behaving badly. And she has, oh, this happens when people are young. He has the potential to become a good husband. So she marries him. And when she marries him, he's still behaving badly. And she says, oh, he has the potential after we get children to become a good father. And then they have children, and the fatherhood is not necessarily a demonstration of the greatest fatherhood, or at least not what she expected the potential would be. And then she says, oh, well, when the kids are grown, he has the potential to be a good companion as we age together. Then the kids grow up and they leave home. And she says, oh, he has the potential when I'm old and frail to take care of me. And the idiot decides to die before her and dies with potential. It is useful in the discussion, Excellency, of both the relations of Africa and the EU and the relations of Africa with Africa, that we go beyond the discussion of potential. And I'm glad and endeared by your presence at Tana, as are the organizers, because I think it's a signification that unlike most people who reduce this lovely continent of ours to flora, fauna, the big five, and mountains, and natural resources, zinc, cobalt, and so on and so forth, there has emerged a cadre of people and a thinking that begins to see Africa not in terms of those things that naturally occur, but as a continent where there are actually ideas, there are actually thoughts. As you would have said, a land of ideas, a land of innovation, and a land of transformation. May the partnership that you have authored with the continent, in particular around the trade agenda, may it strengthen, may it deepen, and may it move beyond potential. May you all enjoy your break and see you at the next session at 5. Thank you, Excellency. Thank you.
You just forgot the potential to be.
Okay. The next one, yeah. Are we ready? I'd like to welcome you to the last session of the 5th day of the 2020 Tana Forum. We're going to have a side event, which is our 4th side event in this year's Tana Forum, with the theme Peace and Stability, a recipe for successful AfCFTA implementation. This is being co-hosted with Humanity United. The moderator for this session is Dr. Akwasi Aidu, who's a senior fellow at Humanity United. Humanity United is a grant-making foundation dedicated to promoting peace, human rights, and human rights around the world. Dr. Akwasi Aidu serves on the boards of several international organizations, including the International Development Research Center and Human Rights Watch. I now hand over to Dr. Akwasi Aidu, and he has a very exciting panel of eminent practitioners in this field. I will return. Only one of the speakers is in the room. Dr. Akwasi Aidu will introduce his panel. Akwasi, over to you. I'm hoping. So Akwasi, I've already introduced you.
Hello, can you hear me?
I think you can go ahead.
Thank you. I thank you very much, and I'm very happy to facilitate this exciting, really critical session side event, which is an exploration of the interconnections between peace and stability on the one hand, and the successful implementation of the African Free Trade Area Agreement on the other hand. We have a team of 5 highly esteemed, accomplished, distinguished people, Africans, who will be addressing 2 key questions. The speakers are first, Yemi Kebede, and Yemi Kebede is head of the Life and Peace Institute Regional Office in Addis Ababa. She's also manager of the Horn of Africa Regional Program, and she brings extensive experience in the area of African policy and advocacy, having worked for many, many years in senior positions within many reputable international organizations. So that is Yemi. The second speaker is Rahimi Musanzi, and Rahimi is the executive coordinator of Centre Résolution Conflit, which is based in DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. She's doing really game-changing work on peace, justice, and community development in the provinces of Ituri and North Kivu in eastern DRC, and she'll bring some really insightful lessons. The third speaker is Desiree Asobavi, who is very well known, international law specialist and expert on Pan-African institutions and African politics. He's worked as the resident representative to the African Union and United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, UNFPA, the UN Population Fund, Oxfam International, and Plan International. So he's got a wide range of experiences across the board. And he coordinated the Africa team of the Coalition for the International Criminal Court. The fourth speaker is also an esteemed person, Fatima Askira. And Fatima is the founding executive director of Bono Women Development Initiative, which is an organization that empowers women and youth for peace building. She's a member of the African Women's Leadership Network and secretary of the network's Nigeria chapter. In addition, she's a member of FemWise Africa, which is an entity that promotes participation of young women in peace-building processes. And her work has focused largely on de-radicalization and the creation of positive alternative narratives for women, girls, and youth in Northeast Nigeria. And the final but not the least speaker is Dr. Jide Okeke, who is the Africa Regional Program Coordinator at UNDP. And he's been a fellow at Harvard University, did some exciting work, and served on had extensive experience with the UN, the African Union, ISS, Institute for Peace and Security Studies, and the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. So, ladies and gentlemen, and your excellencies, those are the 5 key people who will be answering 2 sets of questions. And I'll read out the questions quickly and then we'll begin. The first question is, can the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement be achieved within the current state of peace and security on the continent? And what are the obstacles or bright spots that will enable that to happen? The second question is for them to share some experiences, best practices that can contribute to the peace necessary for the successful implementation of the Free Trade Area Agreement. So we'll start first with the first question, and the speaker I'll call upon to answer that question or to share knowledge, experiences about that question of how the Africa Free Trade Agreement can be successful given the current context of peace and security in Africa. The first speaker is Yemi. So Yemi, over to you, and each speaker will have about 5 minutes, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. Yemi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kwasi, and I'd like to start off by thanking Humanity United and the Tana Forum Secretariat for giving me this opportunity today. All protocols observed due to our time constraint. So in answering your question today, I would like to frame my observations on the Horn of Africa, which we've worked in extensively as the Life and Peace Institute for over 30 years, and the borderlands in this region. So as many of the participants and experts have made reference to over the last few days. And a brief answer to your question is that we will have to take the necessary steps towards the implementation of the AfCFTA, despite the current state of peace and security in our continent, which leaves much to be desired. Therefore, working towards implementation, the circumstances will look very different from what we would define as successful implementation. So I think our aim is for the latter. In the IGAD region, the successful implementation of the AfCFTA could be hampered because of the region's geopolitical fragile political transitions due to persisting conflicts, growing from domestic insurgencies and repressions, transnational organized trafficking of humans, arms, drugs, further afflicting the borderlands and further threatening the human security of communities. Human security issues also exacerbate this complex security environment by serving as both a driver and catalyst for political dissent and fueling armed struggles, increasing susceptibility to violent extremism, and encouraging political clientelism to access resources. And these challenges, in turn, motivate national security-minded responses. So a vicious cycle for which new policy options and innovation, implementation modalities are needed that reach down to the level of communities experiencing conflict. Part of the obstacles we've identified is that there's a lack in analysis, bringing to the fore lived expertise from communities that are experiencing conflict. At the level of policy action, neither conflict impacts at local level nor structural drivers are addressed properly, partly because analysis does not shed light on the broader system at play, and also partly because local actions tends to focus on direct aspects of conflict, meaning that national and regional actions often fail to implement needed policy change in holistic ways. The bright spots, this is part of your question, is that given the complexity and entrenched nature of the region's conflict systems, only structural changes, addressing unequal access to economic and political opportunities, historical injustices and grievances, which will create sustainable change. Addressing structural causes requires considering both national and human security priorities. So in other words, governance, development, and physical security issues need to be tackled in an integrated manner. So for a successful implementation of the AfCFTA, Horn of Africa's peace, security, and stability outlook needs to significantly change to allow the intra-regional mobility of persons, capital, goods, and services. The successful implementation of the AfCFTA will also demand political will and careful coordination between actors at all levels, and to harness the potential that exists in the AfCFTA as a strong pillar for the peace and development nexus, and recognizing the opportunity, I would call it, to transform borderlands into centers of peace and enhanced peace, human security. Thank you.
Of peace and stability, how do you think the free trade agreement will succeed?
Not quite sure whether I heard the question. Was that question addressed to Rehema Akwasi? I'll assume, based on our prior discussion, that question relates to me. Firstly, merci pour la parole, as we say in Congo. Thanks for this invitation and the opportunity to share our thoughts on the importance of peace and security for the successful implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I think to answer the first part of the question, in terms of whether within the current context of peace and security, achieving the African Continental Free Trade Agreement would be successful. I think, as Her Excellency Tete mentioned earlier, it's very important not to be too optimistic or too pessimistic either. I think it's important to understand that this is going to be a challenge for the continent as well as the member states to be able to implement this successfully. I want us to quickly carry out an exercise, actually. If we were to have a look at the continental map of Africa, I think we'd quickly realize that the continent is currently wearing a sash of instability, starting north in Libya with the civil war, and as we begin to move south towards the Sahel as well as the Lake Chad area, countries such as Mali with the recent coup, the stalemate in Nigeria with Boko Haram, the Amazonian crisis in Cameroon, move slightly towards Central Africa, and we find a Central African Republic that is still very fragile. And as we move further east, we begin to recognize that South Sudan is also, although moving towards peace, still fragile, and a few other countries such as Somalia as well as Mozambique down south. But I wanted to focus on the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is my country, the country where I currently live and work, and a country that has been mentioned more than once that was mentioned more than once in the previous panel discussion. The Democratic Republic of Congo is a country with immense potential. And I know that Brian did mention earlier that we should not be saying that any country or any continent has potential, because we don't want any death without any potential, with potential, so to say. But there's an importance here of highlighting how important the Democratic Republic of Congo is to this continent, given its geopolitical position and the fact that it remains a country that connects the north and the south of the continent in terms of its landmass, being the biggest country in Central Africa, in the sub-Saharan Africa, and a country that also connects the east and the west of the continent. So in terms of successfully implementing the FTA, I think, and I'd go as far as saying, with regards to the DRC as well as the other countries I've named and not, or not, that are currently unstable, as a continent, we have to find ways to deal with the instability that exists in order to successfully implement the African Free Trade Agreement. Otherwise, I think not dealing with it now and in the future will certainly lead to destabilizing effects, not just on the countries currently unstable, but also on neighboring countries. And so I think one of the biggest points to highlight is the fact that there are multiple challenges and obstacles to the successful implementation of the agreement. One of them, of course, is the fact that we are known on this continent to write up very good agreements and not completely going all the way with the implementation. I think Dr. Tesfatsui yesterday had mentioned that we need to stop thinking that action planning is action. And I think that's one of the things that we really need to highlight. I want to focus on two main obstacles, which I think are also bright spots here. One is the youth bulge on this continent.
Okay,
we have a continent with the vast majority of the population under the age of 35. According to the UN, it's around 75%. That population, even in the DRC as well as the rest of the continent, provides a huge opportunity for production as well as investment in the human capital that is young people in this continent. But at the same time, it also is a time bomb. We have a continent that is forecasted to add 1.3 or 1.4 billion people from now up until 2050. And so I think dealing with young people or the youth bulge that currently exists is one of the biggest challenges that we have in order to successfully implement the agreement, mainly because this agreement will certainly bolster the economic development of the continent and provide certainly jobs for this massive group that is going to be added to the population. And finally, I want to also highlight the informal sector. I mean, 80% of the markets in Africa are currently in the informal sector. And I think the way we deal with the informal sector is both an obstacle, but also a bright spot in the sense that quite a lot happens within the sector. We heard of the fact that most of the sector is made up of women. That's an opportunity, a huge opportunity for the continent as well as specific member states. And so I think generally in order to successfully implement the agreement as a continent, we have to ensure that we prioritize stabilization alongside integration, because we cannot, as Excellency Duarte had mentioned earlier, we cannot focus solely on integration and forget the vitality of stabilizing this continent in order to really push for a successful implementation of the agreement. And I think that it's certainly not impossible, but it's going to be a challenge to successfully implement this if we do not focus on successfully
we have
stabilizing
to move to the next speaker.
Countries that are currently unstable.
I'm very sorry, but I should emphasize that everyone has just about 4 minutes. I'm sorry it's going on and on and on. So please, the subsequent speakers, I plead with you to just make it a 4-minute, go straight to the key points, and then we'll move on. Thank you very much. We'll go to Desiree. Brother Desiree, over to you.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to join you. Jumping on the question, can the Continental Free Trade Agreement be achieved today, given the current state of peace and security in our continent? I've looked at 2 reports. The first is the report of the chairperson of TANAP Forum that was presented on Tuesday this week, the report on the state of but also the African Union latest report on the state of peace and security in the continent presented to head of state earlier this year. Looking at this, the situation doesn't seem to be good, as Yemi said it previously. The following countries are still inactive or certain level of fragility in terms of conflict. We have Central African Republic, DRC, Cameroon, Burundi, Sudan, South Sudan, Libya, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Nigeria, Somalia, and so on. Just look at the area occupied by those countries, the continent, to see how much we can get out of the free trade agreement if we do not do something about those conflicts. So the most crucial implication of this fragility now is that it discourages investment. Who want to invest its money within this context of conflict? Now, if we don't have that, how do we take advantage of the free trade agreement? Now, we know there can be a free trade without free movement and safe movement of people and goods. So we are blocked here. We see the impact of the insecurity through how African countries are reacting to the Treaty of Free Movement. The Treaty of Free Movement has been adopted in 2018. As of today, only 4 countries ratified that treaty. Can we really do a free trade agreement without being able to move around? Countries' main reason of not joining that treaty is essentially security concern. So we should not be deceived by the recent positive move on visa on arrival. This is just for tourism. 2 days ago, I hear some high-level personalities trying to dismiss the right of establishment as part of the visa, the free movement treaty. Actually, the right of establishment is needed for the free trade movement to give it all potentials. So just like we have the treaty on democracy in the past and some other treaties, I see the African Continental Free Trade Area Treaty today as essentially symbolic. We still have a lot to do, especially in terms of conflict, for it to happen. My second and last point is that on resolving peace and security concern in Africa, we seem to continue turning around. French say, nous tournons autour du pot, because we are still closing our eyes on the root cause of conflict. And I remember, I'm glad Ambassador Hannah Tete from the UN mentioned it this morning, that the root cause of the conflict are still there and we're not touching them. The real causes, the perpetuating causes of the conflict. You name it, on democratic governance, cosmetic elections within the continent, extreme inequality, lack of accountability and trustable justice mechanism for citizens, and so on and so forth. Now, how can we start getting closer and closer to the solution? Today, when it's going wrong in a given country in the continent, when people and groups are raising and the alarm, the regional bodies, the continental bodies are keeping quiet. because decision makers are head of state and government. And it is generally one of the club member that is in trouble. So everybody keep quiet until the situation explodes. We saw it in South Sudan some year back. We saw it in Libya. We saw it coming in Sudan. We have seen it in Burkina Faso. We have recently seen it in Mali. It's happening now in Cameroon and in Nigeria. And the risk for it to happen in Cote d'Ivoire is just there at the door. Almost everybody predicts what's happened in terms of conflict in Africa, but we wait until it happens. Now, quickly, few solutions. We need to go back to the share value adopted at continental level by the AU. Number two, we need a stronger reformed African Union Commission. We need an executive AU authority that can really concretely hold member states accountable for their own decision that they have taken. And third and lastly, we need an accountability mechanism on the non-respect of those share value. There is an accountability mechanism, a sanction for non-payment of contribution at the AU. We need equally a sanction for the non-respect of the share value if you really want to reach Agenda 2063 through the continental free trade area. I thank you.
Thank you very much for staying within the 4-minute time allocation. We'll move on now to Fatima, and then we'll come to Jide. Yeah, so Fatima, please, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, and good afternoon from Nigeria. For me, I think most of the points have been spoken very well too, but just to reiterate the fact that it's not impossible to achieve the AfCFTA in Africa, but then it's very, very important that we look at the nitty-gritties of the push and pull factors, the drivers, the root causes of this violent extremism, civil unrest, and other rising insecurity threats across the African countries. And this is very important because without stabilization, I think every nation, every national government is a little bit skeptical about, letting this free movement. And I think this has been one of the effects, or this has been one of the issues we would constantly face, even within regional bodies like the ECOWAS, the IGAD, and stuff like that. So movement cannot be free as long as each of us or each of the African countries is perceiving one another as a threat to its national security, and especially with the fragility of the context right now, which we are seeing swamping down instead of moving ahead. So again, for me, it's also more involvement, more engagement with young people, but then also more involvement of grassroots organization. This is very important because if we want to promote the AfCFTA, we have to ensure that we can that has the whole treaty itself, then coming to the ratification. It's not all about member states signing an agreement and agreeing at a particular level, perhaps the AU level and other regional level. But then we also have to look at it through the ratification and its domestication and implementation at state level. What is the commitment of our national government when we talk about this AfCFTA? Is it just an agenda to have it on the headlines and I am an African and we check the box and we take it and we move ahead? Or are we really looking at the implementation and how we are trying to ensure that the barriers around insecurity, the differences, the languages is not stopping us from ensuring that we are implementing this across Africa? But then, looking at the shrinking spaces and currently the unrest, let's take an example of Nigeria. We are having a massive protest of first of its kind here in Nigeria, and then you were seeing the effect. Everyone is seeing the effect, and particularly on young people. And these are the future we are talking about, the future of Africa. And then we are losing trust from the government, So these are all implications. And then this is something that is making the system more rigid and less flexible. And when we are talking about AfCFTA, we're looking at flexibility and looking at options to which everyone feels safe and everyone feel comfortable